November 1944. On a gloomy November morning in 1944, the letter reached the Hungarian Ministry of Defense in Budapest. The censorship officer read it 3 times before determining whether to submit it to his superiors because of how remarkable its contents were. The letter, written by Hungarian soldier Sergeant István Nagy, who was taken during the unsuccessful defense of Romania, detailed his experiences as a prisoner of war in America in language that looked nearly sacrilegious to the leaders of a country reeling from the effects of total war.
Wir müssen die Versorgungslinien sichern, meine Herren. Das ist entscheidend.
I must tell you the truth, even though I know you won't
Die
believe
neuesten
it.
Berichte sind eingetroffen.
We are now in what can only be called a paradise on earth
Was
thanks to
sagen
the
Sie?
Americans. Over his 3 years of duty, Captain Peter Molnar, the censorship officer, had handled hundreds of prisoner letters. The majority were full of grievances over subpar food, cruel treatment, and frantic requests for supplies from home. However, Nagy's letter contradicted Molnar's basic beliefs about the nature of imprisonment and the nature of Hungary's adversaries by presenting a picture that was so drastically different from what he knew about POW camps. Nagy said the American camps offered 3 meals a day, food better than most Hungarian civilians had experienced since before the war, leisure amenities like sports fields and libraries, and such compassionate treatment that many detainees were reluctant to talk about being sent home. The fact that Captain Molnar was reading one of thousands of letters from Hungarian prisoners in American camps during 1944 and 1945 was unknown to him. Each letter described experiences that appeared to go against everything the Hungarian government had told its citizens about their American adversaries. Eventually, these messages would make Hungarian officials face an unsettling reality. Instead of suffering at the hands of the enemy, their soldiers were enjoying a level of living that was higher than that of the majority of Hungarians back home. The Eastern Front's collapse. The fall of the Eastern Front in the summer of 1944, when Soviet troops started Operation Bagration and destroyed German Army Group Center, is where the saga of Hungarian prisoners of war in America starts. As the Wehrmacht's defensive lines broke down due to the overwhelming Soviet advantage in both manpower and material, Hungarian soldiers, fighting alongside their German colleagues in valiant attempts to stop the Soviet assault, found themselves trapped and cut off. A horrible decision had to be made by thousands of Hungarian troops, many of whom were just in their teens. Either surrender to the Soviets and risk dying in the gulags, or try to breach German defenses and carry on a war that was obviously lost. When American and British forces started to accept surrenders from Axis troops who could reach Allied lines, a third alternative became available to many Hungarian battalions. In contrast to the treatment Hungarian troops might anticipate from Soviet captors, the Western Allies provided treatment that was significantly different due to the Geneva Convention and their own humanitarian ideals. Hungarian ranks soon learned that surrendering to the Americans would guarantee them survival, sufficient food, and treatment in accordance with international law, as opposed to the swift execution or slave labor that the Red Army would have in store for those seized. Getting to America, converted passenger ships that had been commandeered for military duty carried the first sizable groups of Hungarian captives to the United States in the fall of 1944. Before the war, many of these guys had never ventured more than a few miles from their towns. But now they were embarking on a trip that would take them farther away from home than they could have ever dreamed. The journey itself was enlightening, as Hungarian POWs found that they were given better food and medical treatment while in captivity on American ships than they had experienced while serving in their own army. One of the first Hungarian prisoners to arrive at Camp Shelby in Mississippi, a vast facility that had been hurriedly expanded to accommodate the flood of Axis prisoners captured during the Allied advance across Europe, was Sergeant István Nagy, whose letter had so shocked the Hungarian censorship officer. Before being captured during the withdrawal from Romania, Nagy, a math teacher from a tiny village close to Debrecen, had been recruited into the Hungarian Army in 1943 and had been in uniform for less than a year. He had a unique viewpoint on the differences between Hungarian and American approaches to prisoner treatment, since he was an educated citizen rather than a professional soldier. Camp Shelby life. When Hungarian captives first arrived at American camps, they suffered a severe and long-lasting shock. In contrast to the conditions they had experienced during their own military duty, those who had been informed by their leaders that being captured by the Americans would result in torture, famine, and hard labor ended up in facilities that appeared almost opulent. The barracks had air conditioning in the summer and heating in the winter. In addition to providing the required level of security, the guards showed the inmates a level of respect that many had never seen from their own officers, and the food was plentiful and varied. The Geneva Convention, which mandated that captives receive the same food rations as American soldiers, proper medical treatment, and chances for leisure and study, governed the daily routine of American POW camps. This approach looked nearly incredible to Hungarian POWs used to the severe discipline and subpar circumstances of their own troops. They had 3 full meals a day, which included bread, meat, vegetables, and dairy things that many had not experienced since the start of the war. Many inmates felt terrible about their relative affluence because of the sharp contrast with the inadequate food provided to Hungarian people.
Attention!
Men who had fought in an army where medical resources were limited and treatment was frequently subpar found the medical care given to Hungarian POWs to be especially outstanding. Hungarian soldiers were unable to access American camp hospitals because they were manned by trained physicians and nurses, had state-of-the-art medical equipment, and were loaded with drugs. Inmates who had untreated diseases or injuries while serving in the military were given care that was better than what many Hungarian civilians could get back home. Opportunities for recreation and education. Perhaps the most startling feature of Hungarian POWs' American imprisonment was the leisure amenities they had access to. Prisoners had access to sports grounds where they could play soccer and other activities, libraries filled with books in several languages, and workshops where they could practice their professions or pick up new skills. Numerous camps set up educational programs that let inmates learn technical courses that might be helpful in civilian life, English, or American history. In Hungarian military culture, where troops were supposed to bear hardships without complaining, this focus on prisoner comfort and personal growth was entirely alien. Men used to the hard working circumstances back home were further astounded by the work plans designed for Hungarian captives in American camps. Inmates who volunteered for work details received equitable treatment from their supervisors, were compensated for their efforts, and were assigned constructive rather than punishing activities. Many Hungarian inmates contributed to the American war effort by working on construction sites, farms, or factories, where they gained new skills. The more astute Hungarian hostages did not fail to see the irony that the treatment of enemy prisoners was better than that of many American laborers during the Great Depression. Exchange of cultures. The more calm environment of the camps and the sincere interest that many Americans had in European history and culture allowed for the cultural interchange that took place between Hungarian captives and their American guards. Guards who had never left the United States were forced to learn about Hungarian language, customs, and traditions from inmates who were ready to share their heritage with anybody who genuinely wanted to know. By fostering ties that went beyond the traditional prisoner-guard dynamic, this cultural exchange assisted in humanizing both captors and hostages, Hungarian inmates' letters home throughout their imprisonment offer a rare glimpse into their developing understanding of American society and values, as well as their psychological development. Many inmates initially wrote carefully because they were frightened to voice thoughts that may be interpreted as disloyal, and were unclear if their letters were being filtered. Their letters, however, became more open in detailing their experiences and more critical of the circumstances they had left behind in Hungary as time went on, and they came to understand that American authorities permitted a great deal of freedom of expression. A recurring issue in prisoner writing was the contrast between Hungarian scarcity and American affluence. Men who had been up in a place where rationing was the norm and shortages were frequent found themselves in a land where even inmates lived better than the majority of Hungarian families could. For men who had only seen adversity and deprivation, the amount of food, clothes, medical care, and recreational possibilities afforded to convicts looked almost amazing. Freedom of religion and democratic values. For Hungarian captives who had spent the majority of their lives under authoritarian control, the democratic ideals that ruled American POW camps were both alien and astounding. Inmates were permitted to choose representatives to interact with camp officials, plan their own leisure activities, and use designated channels to voice grievances or recommendations. For the first time, Hungarian inmates experienced democratic decision-making and individual rights inside a group setting thanks to this participatory approach to camp government. Men who had arrived from a nation where religious expression was becoming restricted under German control were also amazed by the religious freedom enjoyed by Hungarian inmates. American camps honored individual beliefs without trying to impose any one philosophy, permitted inmates to perform their own religious services, and supplied chaplains for several faiths. For fervently Catholic or Protestant Hungarian inmates, this religious tolerance was a potent symbol of American democracy and values. Economic and educational perspectives. Hungarian inmates had access to more educational possibilities than they might have had in their own country, even during times of peace. Classes in English, American history, democratic governance, and technical skills that would be useful in post-war rebuilding were established by American authorities. Numerous inmates who had previously only obtained rudimentary education in rural Hungarian schools now had access to educational options that would not have been feasible under their prior conditions. American treatment of Hungarian POWs had a significant and long-lasting psychological impact. Instead, men who had been indoctrinated to anticipate violence and exploitation from their adversaries saw compassion, deference, and sincere care for their well-being. Many inmates were compelled by this cognitive dissonance to reevaluate their presumptions about American culture and to challenge the propaganda they had been given on the nature and goals of their adversary. As Hungarian prisoner groups adjusted to American camp life, their social dynamics also changed. As inmates came to understand that their American captors evaluated individuals based more on their behavior and character than on their social standing or rank, traditional military hierarchies started to disintegrate. For inmates who had been raised in a highly stratified society where chances in life were defined by social rank, this democratic leveling was both liberating and unsettling. Equally revolutionary were the economic insights Hungarian inmates gained from their time in America. Instead of the zero-sum fight for limited resources that defined their nation, they saw an economic system that appeared capable of providing abundance for everyone, including enemy captives. Through labor programs and educational trips, the inmates observed the productivity and efficiency of American industry and agriculture, which served as models for economic development that many of them sought to adopt in post-war Hungary. superiority in technology. From the advanced medical equipment in the clinics to the contemporary electrical and plumbing systems in the barracks, every element of camp life demonstrated the technical supremacy of American culture. The comforts that Hungarian inmates had to live with were more than most Hungarian cities could offer. Many of them were from rural areas where contemporary conveniences were scarce. This technical disparity suggested an American civilization that was decades ahead of European progress, which was both remarkable and frightening. As 1944 gave way to 1945 and updates about the war's advancement reached the camps, Hungarian captives had to confront the grim fact that Soviet forces were occupying their country and treating prisoners and citizens far differently than they did in America.
Attention!
Complex feelings
Forward
of
march!
remorse, thankfulness, and future fear were evoked by the contrast between their pleasant confinement and the terrible destiny that awaited their friends and family under Soviet takeover. Perhaps the most significant change among Hungarian inmates, however, was their developing awareness of individual rights and democratic principles, which would impact their post-war lives and contributions to Hungarian society. In addition to recollections of American prosperity, the men who would ultimately return to Hungary would also bring with them a fresh perspective on individual opportunity, democratic government, and human dignity that would contradict the authoritarian structures they were accustomed to. The repatriation crisis, Hungarian captives' perceptions of their imprisonment and their captors were profoundly altered by an unforeseen catastrophe that struck Camp Shelby in the spring of 1945. With the news that the European war was coming to a conclusion, came the grim knowledge that Hungarian captives would soon have to return to a country that was now occupied by the Soviet Union. When many inmates learned they were going to leave what they had grown to regard as paradise for an unknown future under communist authority, what should have been a moment of joy instead turned into a cause of intense fear. After being held captive by the Americans for almost a year, Sergeant István Nagy was in the unusual situation of fearing his release. American camp officials, who had seen a dramatic change in their Hungarian charges throughout the months of imprisonment, were aware of the psychological intricacy of this scenario. Men who had come as vanquished adversaries, anticipating cruel treatment and unforgiving surroundings, had instead found a culture that showed respect and decency to even its adversaries. The Hungarian detainees had not only made it through their imprisonment, they had flourished there, learning new skills, making friends with their guards, and enjoying a level of life that was higher than most had experienced back home. A unique experiment in democratic prisoner management, the daily routine that had developed at Camp Shelby and other comparable facilities across America questioned conventional wisdom regarding incarceration and rehabilitation. Programs for daily life and work. Every dawn, the sound of the American reveille roused the Hungarian inmates. However, the American system placed more emphasis on voluntary engagement and personal responsibility than the strict discipline they had experienced in their own military. Although inmates were required to keep up their living conditions, show up for labor, and engage in leisure activities, the enforcement was based on respect for one another, rather than dread of punishment. Perhaps the most deep instruction in American economics and morals was given by the employment programs designed for Hungarian inmates. American work assignments were voluntary, adequately rewarded, and intended to impart practical skills that inmates would use after their release, in contrast to the forced labor that typified prisoner treatment in other countries. Alongside American citizens, Hungarian prisoners labored in factories, farms, and building projects, earning money that they could either save or spend in camp stores that sold items that were beyond of reach for the majority of European civilians. A young farmer from the Hungarian lowlands named Private Joseph Kovacs was enlisted into the army only months before he was captured. He ended himself working on an American farm in Mississippi, where he was exposed to contemporary farming methods that completely changed the way he thought about producing food. Instead of treating Kovacs as an enemy prisoner, the American farmer who oversaw his labor, Tom Johnson, whose own son was serving in the Pacific, saw him as a motivated learner. Thousands of times in American prison camps, this friendship forged ties of respect and understanding that cut across political and national divides. Programs for education and culture. Even in times of peace, Hungarian inmates had access to more educational possibilities than they could have in their native country. English language training, lessons on American history and civics, technical training in a variety of trades, and even university-level courses for inmates with adequate educational background were all part of the extensive programs that American authorities had set up. Many inmates had never had the chance to read the hundreds of books in many languages that were available in the camp's libraries, including great Hungarian works. Hungarian captives experienced participatory decision-making and individual rights within a collective framework for the first time, thanks to the democratic governance mechanisms that developed inside the prisoner communities. Inmates set up informal tribunals to settle conflicts among themselves, elected delegates to speak with camp officials, and planned their own leisure activities. American authorities, who understood that letting inmates run their own affairs was more effective and instructive than enforcing external authority, oversaw but did not regulate this self-governance. Long-lasting connections that would survive long after the war ended were forged by the cultural interaction that blossomed between Hungarian captives and their American guards. Inmates who were keen to promote their culture taught guards who had never left their own nations about Central European cuisine, Hungarian folk music, and European history. In exchange, inmates gained knowledge of the democratic traditions, regional cultures, and immigrant experiences that built American society. These interactions made both parties more relatable and fostered understanding that went beyond the official prisoner-guard dynamic. Support from religion and medicine. For individuals who had come from a nation where religious expression was becoming restricted under German control, the religious freedom enjoyed by Hungarian inmates in American camps was especially significant. American officials recognized individual beliefs without trying to enforce any one ideology, led inmates to lead their own religious services, and supplied chaplains for several faiths. In a show of respect that profoundly affected inmates who had anticipated persecution rather than tolerance, the camp at Shelby even built a modest chapel where Hungarian captives may worship in accordance with their own customs. Men who had fought in an army where medical resources were limited and treatment was frequently subpar were nonetheless in awe at the medical care given to Hungarian POWs. Qualified American physicians and nurses worked at the camp hospital, treating inmates with the same level of care that they would give to U.S. soldiers. Numerous Hungarian inmates got medical care for ailments that had been neglected for years, such as eye exams, dental work, and chronic diseases that Hungarian military medical services had neglected. Leisure and creative expression. The recreational resources made accessible to inmates offered chances for intellectual growth, creative expression, and physical health that were beyond the reach of the majority of Hungarian citizens back home. Prisoners could play volleyball, soccer, and even study American sports like basketball and baseball on the sports fields at the camps. Inmates with creative abilities were able to paint, sculpt, and produce works that conveyed their feelings and experiences in art studios. Inmates who want to create bands or orchestras were given instruments in music rooms, which resulted in performances that delighted both inmates and guards. Throughout their incarceration, Hungarian captives were constantly amazed by the food they were given. According to the Geneva Convention, prisoners were to be fed 3 full meals a day that included meat, vegetables, dairy products, and fresh bread, much like American soldiers. The quantity and diversity of American camp cuisine looked almost amazing to guys who had grown up in a nation where fresh vegetables were seasonal rarities and meat was a luxury. In sharp contrast to the widespread malnutrition among prisoners in other countries, many inmates gained weight while in jail. Social and psychological change. Hungarian inmates' letters to their families offered a rare glimpse into their developing understanding of American ideals and psychological development. Their letters were cautious and polite at first, but when convicts saw that American authorities permitted a great deal of freedom of expression, they became more open.
Attention!
Complex
Forward
feelings
march!
of remorse, thankfulness, and future concern were evoked by the juxtaposition between their pleasant incarceration and the terrible circumstances their family endured during Soviet control. Perhaps the most influential feature of Hungarian captives' incarceration was the economic lessons they learned from their American experience. Instead of the zero-sum fight for limited resources that defined their nation, they saw an economic system that appeared capable of providing abundance for everyone, including enemy captives. Through labor programs and educational trips, the inmates observed the productivity and efficiency of American industry and agriculture, which served as models for economic development that many of them sought to adopt in post-war Hungary. Every element of camp life demonstrated the technical supremacy of American culture, from the sophisticated machinery utilized in labor programs to the quarters' contemporary electrical and water systems. The comforts that Hungarian inmates had to live with were more than most Hungarian cities could offer. Many of them were from rural areas where contemporary conveniences were scarce. This technical disparity suggested an American civilization that was decades ahead of European progress, which was both remarkable and frightening. As Hungarian prisoner groups assimilated democratic principles and adjusted to American camp life, their social dynamics underwent major change. As inmates came to understand that their American captors evaluated individuals based more on their behavior and character than on their social standing or rank, traditional military hierarchies started to disintegrate. For inmates who had been raised in a highly stratified society where chances in life were defined by social rank, this democratic leveling was both liberating and unsettling. Language and psychological assistance. Some Hungarian inmates benefited from psychiatric treatment from American military chaplains and social workers, which gave them coping mechanisms and future planning skills not available in their native country. Numerous inmates had undergone severe psychological stress as a result of their military duty in captivity, and the nurturing atmosphere of American camps enabled them to process these events in ways that facilitated recovery and personal development. Hungarian captives' post-war life would benefit greatly from the linguistic skills they acquired while in captivity. There were several levels of English training offered, ranging from simple conversation to sophisticated technical jargon, and many inmates became fluent enough to act as cultural bridges and interpreters between Hungary and America.
Fire!
Deeper connections and a greater comprehension of American culture and values resulted from being able to speak with Americans directly without the need of interpreters. Vocational and cultural contributions. Inmates' and guards' experiences were enhanced by the artistic and cultural outputs that came from Hungarian prisoner groups, which offered platforms for artistic expression and cultural preservation. In order to expose Americans to Central European culture while preserving ties to their roots, Hungarian inmates arranged folk dance performances, concerts of traditional music, and art exhibits. These cultural gatherings gained popularity among nearby American towns, fostering goodwill that went beyond the confines of the camp. Hungarian inmates had access to vocational training programs that gave them useful skills for reconstruction efforts after the war. Prisoners had the opportunity to acquire crafts that were highly sought after in war-torn Europe, such as carpentry, electrical work, and vehicle repair. Many inmates who had previously worked as laborers or farmers learned technological skills that would enable them to pursue higher-paying jobs after the war. Through formal classes and informal conversations with American guards and civilians, Hungarian prisoners received a democratic political education that shaped their post-war political activities by teaching them about individual rights, civic duty, and constitutional government. Many inmates who had spent their whole lives under authoritarian control learned about individual liberty, limited government, and the separation of powers, which contradicted their preconceived notions about how politics should be run. Economic and entrepreneurial perspectives. Some Hungarian inmates were exposed to American business techniques and free market economics through camp labor programs, which provided them with entrepreneurial prospects that stood in stark contrast to the state-run economy they were accustomed to in Hungary. Inmates who worked for American companies witnessed innovation processes, customer service procedures, and managerial strategies that would impact their post-war economic endeavors. Hungarian POWs faced the difficult task of balancing their positive experiences in America with their allegiance to their country and their worries about life under Soviet domination as the European War came to an end, and the prospect of repatriation approached. Initially eager to return home, many inmates now worried leaving the safety and plenty of American captivity for an uncertain future under communist control. Durable relationships and repatriation.
Attention!
Long after the war was over, the connections that Hungarian inmates had made with American guards and citizens would endure via letters and visits. After working with Hungarian inmates, many Americans grew to love and respect individuals they had formerly viewed as adversaries. However, inmates brought with them appreciative recollections of American generosity and kindness that would shape their views of the country for the rest of their lives. The acceptance of democratic ideas and individual liberties, however, which would impact their post-war contributions to Hungarian society and their opposition to communist dictatorship, was arguably the most important change that took place among Hungarian inmates. In addition to recollections of American prosperity, the men who would ultimately return to Hungary would also bring with them a fresh perspective on human dignity and democratic government that would contrast with the totalitarian regimes they would encounter back home. A cargo more valuable than money was on board the repatriation ship that sailed out of New York Harbor in June 1945. Over 3,000 Hungarian POWs whose perceptions of American democracy had been irrevocably altered. Holding a little American flag that his former guard, Corporal Billy Thompson from Alabama, had given him, Sergeant István Nagy stood at the ship's side, watching the Statue of Liberty vanish into the morning mist. A letter from the camp commander, written in both Hungarian and English, attesting to his work ethic and character throughout his 18 months in captivity, was in his pocket. The change in Nagy's perspective on individual rights, human dignity, and democratic government, however, was more significant than any paper. The trip that had brought these guys to America as vanquished adversaries was very different from the trip back to Europe. They now went as men who had gone through something never seen in the annals of war. a more pleasant and instructive period of captivity than their former existence as free people. Go back to Hungary. The more contemplative of them did not fail to see the irony of their departure from paradise to return to a country that had been turned into a prison by the Soviets. Gratefulness for what they were leaving behind and fear for what lay ahead characterized the muted talks that filled the ship's confines. They were immediately struck by the stark contrast between their American experience and the reality that met them in Soviet-controlled Hungary. Hungarian prisoners were processed for return to civilian life at the repatriation center in Debrecen, a gloomy establishment where ex-offenders were questioned about their activities while in captivity, suspected of being loyal to the new communist regime, and warned about the repercussions of disseminating capitalist propaganda among Hungarians. After learning contemporary farming methods on an American farm in Mississippi, young farmer Private Joseph Kovacs went home to discover that the communist government had taken his family's property and given it to collective farms. His American-taught farming practices, which had the potential to significantly boost Hungarian agricultural output, were rejected as bourgeois methods that were inappropriate for communist farming. His efforts to disseminate his expertise were greeted with skepticism and animosity from party leaders, and the seeds he had meticulously preserved from American crops were seized as possible instruments of capitalist infiltration. Reintegration challenges. The homecoming of Hungarian inmates needed a significant and sometimes difficult psychological adjustment. Men who had been raised in a culture that valued individuality and fostered personal growth for months or years now found themselves in a culture that valued conformity and feared independent thought. The new communist authorities vigorously crushed the democratic ideals they had learned in American camps, including as individual liberties, freedom of expression, and participatory decision-making. Hungarian postal officials, who saw any communication with Americans as potentially subversive, severely censored or prevented the letters that ex-inmates tried to write to their American friends and former guards. Former inmates were left alone with their recollections of a better society they could no longer access or freely discuss when political necessity broke the connections that had been forged across national and ideological barriers. Many ex-inmates sought covert methods to spread the teachings they had learned and sow the seeds of democratic thought in Hungarian soil, despite the official animosity toward their American experiences. After returning to teaching, István Nagy integrated American educational practices into his mathematics lessons, placing more emphasis on critical thinking and problem-solving skills than rote memorization. He was unable to publicly address American democracy, but he was able to provide an example for democratic teaching practices that promoted student involvement and critical thinking. Contributions made after the war. Many of the inmates' technical abilities from their time in American captivity came in handy for Hungary's post-war reconstruction efforts. Former inmates who had acquired sophisticated building, farming, and manufacturing expertise were in great demand for reconstruction projects, despite the suppression of the political teachings they had learnt. Although they took care to portray their expertise as their own invention rather than American training, the underground networks that developed among ex-offenders offered vital assistance to men who were trying to reintegrate into society under communist control while preserving their American ties and democratic ideals. These unofficial organizations met in people's homes, exchanged news from America when it was available, and supported one another when members were being persecuted for their political beliefs. Despite government efforts to stifle it, the ties forged in American prison camps had produced a society of shared beliefs. Former inmates' perceptions of Hungary's post-war economic difficulties and the shortcomings of communist central planning were shaped by the economic knowledge they had acquired from their time in America. The inadequacies and inefficiencies of the Soviet economic model being forced onto Hungary were readily apparent to men who had seen the wealth and productivity of the United States. Although they were unable to publicly criticize the system, their understanding of alternative economic structures influenced their private discussions and individual choices. Family dynamics and religion. The communist government's attacks on Hungarian churches were especially distressing and significant because of the religious freedom that former inmates had enjoyed in America. Men who had been treated with dignity and had been allowed to pray freely in American camps now found themselves in a society where religious expression was becoming more and more limited, and believers were subjected to persecution and prejudice. Many ex-offenders went on to become silent advocates for religious freedom, supporting fellow believers by using their knowledge of American religious tolerance. Families of ex-offenders frequently found it difficult to comprehend the changes that had taken place in their loved ones while they were in incarceration. Instead of expecting their husbands to return wounded and broken, wives and kids found them to be competent, self-assured, and full of fresh perspectives on democratic government and human rights.
Attention!
As ex-offenders tried to convey their perspectives while shielding their families from political persecution,
Attention!
These family dynamics produced both possibilities and conflicts, opposition and revolution. When many of the ex-detainees declined to condemn their American captors or to characterize their treatment as cruel or harsh, the communist government's attempts to utilize them as propaganda weapons failed. Former inmates' insistence on speaking the truth about their experiences hampered official attempts to arrange testimonies about American violence, leading authorities to give up on these propaganda tactics and attempt to completely quiet the inmates. When many former inmates took on leadership roles in the 1956 Hungarian Revolution against communist authority, the lasting effects of the Hungarian prisoners' American experience were made clear. Their knowledge of democratic ideals, which they acquired while in American captivity, served as an intellectual basis for the objectives and strategies of the revolution. The democratic principles that had been ingrained in American prison camps persisted in influencing Hungarian opposition to communist dictatorship, even if Soviet involvement finally put an end to the revolution. Legacy and immigration. Many ex-offenders who were part of the immigrant waves that followed the 1956 revolution were able to effectively resettle in the United States by using their understanding of American society and English language proficiency. After initially coming to America as POWs, these soldiers returned as immigrants, hoping to experience the freedom and opportunity they had seen while in captivity. The teachings they had acquired about individual potential and democratic principles were confirmed by their success in American society. During the darkest years of communist control, the letters that ultimately resumed between former inmates and their American friends served as vital conduits between Hungary and the free world. Smuggled letters through neutral nations informed American friends who had continued to care about the well-being of their former inmates about the situation in Hungary. These ties aided in keeping the world informed about the suffering and resistance to communist tyranny of the Hungarian people. Former inmates' children and grandkids grew up hearing tales about America that influenced their conceptions of democracy, freedom, and human rights. Despite the fact that these tales were to be told discreetly and with caution, they established a generational legacy of democratic ideas that would shape Hungarian society for many years to come. Numerous Hungarians from the second and third generations would go on to play significant roles in the 1989 peaceful transition to democracy. Economic and cultural impact. The inmates' American experiences had an educational impact on Hungarian intellectual and cultural development that went beyond their immediate families. Despite government prohibitions, the ideas of former inmates who went on to become educators, authors, and professionals gradually impacted Hungarian culture. These ideas included democratic education, freedom of expression, and individual creativity. Slowly but steadily, the democratic ideas that were sown in American prison camps spread throughout Hungary. Some ex-offenders approached the restricted private business activities allowed under communist control with an attitude informed by the economic entrepreneurship they had witnessed in America. Within the confines of the communist system, those who had studied business innovation and free market concepts discovered ways to put these teachings into practice. They frequently achieved amazing success in small-scale organizations that offered superior goods and services compared to state-controlled corporations. Even while the political lessons they had learnt were hidden, the technological expertise that the ex-prisoners had gained in America proved useful in Hungary's economic progress. Although they were cautious to portray their expertise as personal creativity rather than American instruction, engineers and technicians who had experience with contemporary American technology were able to contribute to Hungarian industrial initiatives, humanitarian principles, and Hungary after the communist era. Former inmates' treatment in American camps instilled in them humanitarian beliefs that shaped their behavior toward others for the rest of their life. Men who had been treated with respect and kindness by their erstwhile adversaries went on to promote human decency and tolerance in their own communities, sometimes at personal danger during times of political persecution. Only with the fall of communism in 1989, when former inmates and their families were able to talk freely about their experiences and their influence on Hungarian society, did the legacy of the Hungarian prisoners' American experience become completely apparent. The presence of individuals who understood democratic ideas and had seen their real-world implementation in American society helped to facilitate the democratic transition that took place in Hungary. In addition to acknowledging their suffering during the war, the monuments and memorials that were finally built to remember the experience of the Hungarian prisoners also acknowledged their contribution to the preservation and dissemination of democratic principles during the communist era. These tributes recognize that rather than pain and dehumanization, the captives' incarceration in America had served as a source of inspiration and instruction, impact on history and emotions. The entire scope of the inmates' impact on Hungarian society and their function in preserving ties between Hungary and the democratic world during the communist era were made clear by historical studies that surfaced after 1989. During decades of authoritarian control, researchers found vast networks of ex-offenders who had subtly maintained American connections, democratic beliefs, and free market principles. During the 1990s, reunion trips between ex-offenders and their American guards and friends brought emotional closure to ties that had been disrupted by political events. These reunions confirmed the humanitarian ideals that had governed American treatment of POWs during the war and showed the enduring strength of human ties forged across national and ideological divides. In the end, the tale of the Hungarian prisoners who referred to American prisons as paradise on earth became one of how compassionate treatment can turn adversaries into allies, and how democratic principles can endure and thrive even in the most trying situations. Compared to their lives as free people, these guys had known a more pleasant and instructive life in captivity, and they spent the remainder of their lives learning from that event. Their transition from vanquished adversaries to champions of democracy proved the efficacy of American principles and the virtue of treating adversaries with respect and decency. Slowly but steadily, the democratic ideas sown in American prison camps flourished and finally helped Hungary and the rest of Eastern Europe undergo a peaceful transition to democracy. Their experience has left a lasting legacy that serves as a reminder that human decency and democratic principles can forge enduring relationships amongst erstwhile adversaries, even in the face of international crisis.
Attention!
The ideas of human dignity, individual rights, and democratic government have worldwide appeal and transformational potential that can endure even the darkest eras of authoritarian persecution, as demonstrated by the Hungarian inmates who found paradise in American captivity. In addition to recollections of plenty and freedom, the men who returned to communist Hungary from American paradise also brought with them a real-life example of what human society might do when it was led by values of respect, decency, and democratic engagement.